Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. Welcome to PCAP's Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Kaitlyn Mroz, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Tom Harrison from SODCAP will be talking about species at risk habitat, the provision of ecological goods and services in Southwest Saskatchewan. This week, we have a series of webinars going on about ecological goods and services provided by Native Prairie. On Tuesday, March 20th, that's tomorrow, Brian McConkey with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada will talk about challenges and opportunities for including soil organic carbon on pastures and rangelands as an ecological good. On Wednesday, March 21st, Chris Elder with Alice Canada will be presenting about Stewardship is a team sport, Alice Partnerships in the County of Vermilion River. Check out the PCAP website to register for these webinars or for more information about specific presentations. Just click on the Upcoming Events tab. I would like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by Environment and Climate Change Canada, Wildlife Habitat Canada, and Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Now, a bit about our presenter. Tom Harrison is currently the Executive Director for the South of the Divide Conservation Action Program, Inc. He has been involved with agri-environmental program delivery for over 25 years. Tom and his wife Tracy and daughter Kaitlyn manage a 250-head cow-calf operation. So Tom, if you're there, you're welcome to go ahead.
Okay. So I just want to hit.
Show my screen.
Okay. And we're good. Okay. Well, thank you, Kaitlyn. Appreciate that introduction, and guess we'll get going here. So you saw the title to the presentation and the discussion around ecological goods and services, and I kind of wrote that up to keep in theme with the PCAP theme of the week. So what I want to do today is basically talk about a project that's a collaboration between the South of the Divide and its board members and the Saskatchewan Stock Growers and Environment and Climate Change Canada. If you're not aware, the SODCAP group was created to implement the multi-species action plan for species at risk in Southwest Saskatchewan or in the South of the Divide. And that plan now has been approved by the minister, and that occurred last November. So it's good to go, and that was the main function of this organization. And I want to talk to a little bit about what we're doing here, just one example. So anyways, so if you think about how people, ranchers, agricultural producers, people that own and manage grasslands, how do they make their living? And for the most part, it's off the sale of beef products, whether it's calves in the fall or bred heifers or seed stock or even some guys direct market beef. That's how they make their money. And the decisions are always made to maximize the profitability based on those products. So they're thinking about things like average daily gain. They're thinking about gain per acre, and the best way, and their decisions to make a living that way. So when we start talking about ecological goods and services, we start thinking about what if. What if producers can start making decisions to get paid for how much phosphorus they prevent from contaminating a water system, or how much carbon they sequester by retaining woodlands and grasslands. And that becomes more of an ecological approach, but there has to be some direct rewards for that. And that's kind of the angle that we're taking here, is that we're kind of wanting producers to make decisions to produce habitat for biodiversity and in our case, species at risk, and get financially rewarded for it. It's more than just a coincidence that they've run cattle and they're producing habitat, and at the same time, we have species at risk habitat. So we want to make a conscious effort to do that. So what we did a few years ago was we developed a proposal, and we got funded through the Species at Risk Partnership on an agricultural landscape. And what we wanted to do is look at a number of different programming options for producers that would encourage them to make decisions around species at risk habitat. And we're looking at 6 options on that. And the one I want to talk to today is the results-based conservation agreements. And that is the one option that we really look at as being probably most related to what we would consider ecological goods and services or environmental services. And before I do that, though, I just want to talk about where we do a lot of our work. And it's in the South Divide or in the Milk River watershed, and the reason is there's a lot of grassland in that area. There's 52% of the land is still native, and over 75% is in perennial cover. So that's a fairly significant amount of a landscape that's providing habitat already. So it's an important area of the province. And to match that up, Environment Canada has designated 1 million hectares of that land and for critical habitat. And it's almost a direct overlap of native grassland. So there's a strong overlap there. So that's a large part of the focus of our project. Being that we're working with a stock growers program, the funding is coming from Environment Canada, goes to stock growers, and SODCAP is basically a delivery agent for this group. We do actually work outside of the SODCAP area in areas where there's other, fairly large fragments of grassland. Things like the Missouri Coteau, the Great Sandhills, those are all areas of interest for the SARFAL. So we've been working in results-based conservation agreements basically since the inception of SODCAP, which was back in 2014. Prior to the SARFAL funding, we got funding from Environment Canada to work on greater sage-grouse habitat and develop results-based conservation agreements with people that had land in or really close to the EPO. So we've been doing this for this is going into 4 years right now, and we've got a few more years left in the agreement. So the whole concept of results-based conservation agreements is we identify habitat targets at the site level, and the producer makes his own decisions. He manages the land. If he produces the targets, then he gets rewarded financially. The biggest thing about this is non-prescriptive. It's up to the producer. It's the same as running cattle. We don't tell him what breed to run. We don't tell him when to move his cows or when to market his cows. That decision is up to him, and he does it in the best interest. This is the same sort of thing here. Is that we say, here's the targets we want you to achieve, and if you produce those targets, well, we'll pay you for it. And that's as true to ecological goods and services as I can think of. So the main 2 points of this is it's non-prescriptive, and the decision making is the responsibility of the producer. Having said all this, there are some caveats that go along with this thing. We don't want the targets or the practices to be or just standard farming practices. So everything that we ask the producer to do or achieve has got to be over and above normal agricultural practices. So it's not a matter of coincidence that he's just getting these, and not everybody can get it. we want to be science-based. So the identification of metrics for the habitat targets is based on the current state of knowledge, but we also have to be adaptable. That means that we have to see how they're working. We know that we know some stuff, we know that we don't know some stuff, and we still have to keep working on it. But stay current, stay adapting, take a look at the types of habitat targets that are out there. And we also have to be able to measure and quantify them at the site level again. So, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. And we also have to understand that the habitat is only produced within its ecological potential. So we know that in Southwest Saskatchewan, you have limits of soil, you have limits of climate, and we don't expect to grow a jack pine forest down in Southwest Saskatchewan. So we have to understand that. And these agreements, and I just want to point out, these agreements are recognized in the multi-species risk action plan that was developed for that Southwest. So it's a recognized programming option. So starting with some of the targets, we have to realize that the targets that are out there are different for different life stages of the bird or the species at risk. So whether it's nesting period or a brood rearing period or a wintering period, the habitat targets may change. And right now, we've developed a number of habitat targets for a number of species, and PCAP's led on some of this, and RSA, the Rancher Stewardship Alliance, has led on the development of this, and SODCAP has done some work on these things. So there's a number of species out there. But the two main species that we're really interested in and that we feel really comfortable in signing agreements with are the greater sage-grouse and the Sprague's Pipit. And so when we start identifying targets for greater sage-grouse, obviously one of the things is the silver sage. We want robust, healthy sagebrush plants that provide cover and food for the hens, for the chicks, and we measure that by using a rule bell pole. So the target is basically four segments of a rule bell pole, and I think it's 10 centimeters is that, so or 5 centimeters, and so you're looking at a 20 centimeter target on the rule bell pole measurement as one of the things. The other one is looking at grass dew height. We look to have the target is 19 centimeters for a grass dew height around, on the transect. And then the other thing that's really important is forb cover. Forb cover is necessary for the chicks. And we have a list of preferred forbs that we call. So it's not all forbs, it's a list of preferred forbs that we want, the most desirable for the chicks. And we like to have at least a minimum of 7 to 8% forb cover for them. The other thing that we want, and it's not directly related to habitat targets, but to ensure that we have a healthy range, we want to make sure that our exposed levels and our litter load levels are consistent with the Saskatchewan Rangeland Health Guide. So that makes sure that, one, we have a healthy range, and two, we have the targets achieved. So those are the things that we find necessary for the greater sage-grouse. For the Sprague's Pipit, the three things that we look at is range condition. We know Sprague Pipit, need big areas of native grasslands, and range condition basically is that. So we're looking for range condition in excellent condition, so a score of 75 or better. And when you get that kind of range condition, what you have is a landscape dominated by mid to tall native grasses, things like western and northern wheatgrass, western porcupine grass, green needle grass, and there is minimal levels of woody material, minimal levels of invasive species, like 5% forb covers. So that's the kind of thing they have. So you basically have range conditions in the mid to tall grass. that's really important. And the second thing is that we're looking for litter loads somewhere in the ballpark of about 300 to 900 pounds per acre. And that was developed. I was working with a guy by the name of Phil Rose, and he was doing a lot of bird counts and habitat measurements on some of our project sites. And we just did a lot of work with him and trying to figure out what is the optimal litter loads for that area. So sometimes too much litter may actually negatively affect some of these species, and not enough doesn't provide enough cover. The last thing too is the visual obstruction. So we're looking at a row belt pole. We have a little bit different row belt pole for the Sprague's Pipit, and we use 2 centimeter segments instead of the 5 centimeter segments that we use for the greater sage-grouse. So it's a little bit different, and we want to have some obstruction there as well. And so we're looking at that. I think it's 8 centimeters is what we finally settled on. We've had some discussion about this, and it's still up for a little bit debate what is the best. So those are the big things: range condition, litter, and visual obstruction for Sprague's Pipit. Again, 3 site level targets that we're really trying to achieve. So now that we know that the targets that we're after, and we know we have programming and we have funding to sign results-based agreements, we've been out in the field, we've been talking to people, we've been advertising this program for a number of years, and we do have people interested. So we tend to do a lot of background work before we even get out and visit with the producer. So if a producer comes to us, or we run into a guy that's interested in maybe signing an agreement of this nature, the first thing we do is we start pulling information on the lands that he's interested in, just to determine whether or not we think it's got potential for an agreement of this nature. So the first thing that we actually always look at, and especially in the south of the divide, is the critical habitat. And that layer exists and has been developed by Environment Canada, and we have a GIS person on staff, and we just give her the land locations, and she starts popping out maps. And then you can see this map we've got in front of you. We've got species critical habitat for 4 different species listed on that map: greater sage-grouse, Sprague's Pipit, burrowing owl, and swift fox. So we know, so if this blue hatched area is the land that the guys identified as wanting to potentially put an agreement on, we would say right away, yep, that looks a place we want to work, and it would say, okay, we got to do some further investigation. Some other information we look at is the imagery. We want to make sure that this is native grasslands, and so we'll pop the imagery up, and again, yep, it's native, we want to work there. The other thing that we have access to is the conservation data center at the Ministry of Environment, and those are actual sightings of species at risk or other species too. And so we can actually pop that map up, and it will show us, what's been seen there. They've got their database. This is actually important. As I mentioned, we do work outside the sod area, and the critical habitat has actually only been identified in the Milk River watershed or in the south of the divide. So it's actually important that we can access some of this information. So this is a map actually outside of the sod area, and we know that the guy's all native grasslands. We know that there's probably a strong chance of having grassland type species out there of birds, but let's pop what other data do you find out there? And in this case, we found that there was things like piping plover and raptors, throughout that area. So we knew that when we looked at a place like this, yeah, it seems like an area we'd probably be really interested in working at. So a couple other things that we do is that I don't want to just focus in on Sprague's and greater sage-grouse, so we have to do some basically species at risk richness. So what are the other species at risk critical habitat in those areas? So we have a a layer that determines that. And you can see with this map that, like if it's a really dark green, you only have a species of at-risk richness of 1. If you get into that yellow, you've probably got habitat or critical habitat overlaid on each other for 6 different species. And in the left-hand corner there, you can see that the 6 species that are listed for this area. So that tells us too is that, okay, if we're designing a system that's for greater sage-grouse, we have to be aware that there's 5 other species in that area, and we don't want to do or encourage anything that would negatively affect those species as well. And in fact, like some of the habitat requirements of a McCowan's may be different than that of Sprague's, and I've talked to Phil and Dr. Davis, and kind of what they tell me is that some of their, like a McCowan's habitat may actually be embedded in a larger land base of Sprague's. So we just have to be aware of that, and so it's important that we know what other species or what other critical habitat for species at risk actually exists where we're doing our projects and our agreements. The other thing that we have to look at, as I mentioned, we have to know what the ecological potential for that area is, and a lot of that is determined by the soils. And so we start layering, soils data as well too. And we know that if in some of the solonettic land base, that's where you're going to see sagebrush, and that's where you're going to have habitat for sage-grouse. So that tells us a lot. And if we ever had to go in and do restoration work, or if we ever had to sign agreements, this is kind of the information that we need. So we gather a lot of information before we actually sit down and talk with the producer about actually signing an agreement. Even though he's expressed interest or she's expressed interest in this, we want to talk a lot about what the habitat potential is, what's out there right now, and what's the situation that we're dealing in before we get down there. And then we actually start negotiating with the landowner. We talk about what we want, and obviously that is we want to achieve habitat targets in the land that he owns or manages, and we have to understand what he wants as well too. And so we have to have a dialogue back and forth, and this is more than just free money. This is him making decisions on his land to produce the habitat and retain the habitat to meet those targets, and it's not going to be achieved without him actually doing something. So we do sit down and talk with these guys a lot about that and what we want, and we try to listen to what they want, and we go back and forth and we do the negotiations with him. Once we've come to some sort of an agreement, we actually have drafted a template. And it was done with legal consultation, and it's a legally binding contract between, in the original greater sage-grouse funding, the agreement was between SODCAP and the producer. The agreements under SARPEL are between the Saskatchewan stock growers and the producer. It's just, who has the money and who's playing right now. So we do have templates that work. And those templates lay out the the definitions and where the money comes from and all the legal jargon, but it also it lists out the obligations of either SODCAP or stock growers. It lists out the obligations of the producer. If the land is crown lease, we have to get Minister of Agriculture to sign off on it. And then there's some general provisions, and we discuss issues like privacy. We talk about what happens in case of drought or extreme climate type situations. So we have a bunch of clauses in there that that we've developed over time, and what we want to achieve out there. So there is a legally binding contract that links this guy into this, and he's actually signing it. And a lot of work has actually gone into this agreement. So, and now once the agreement's signed, well, you basically turn it over to the producer, and he's free to start making decisions He can start talking about, how heavy he wants to stock it, the timing of the grazing, whether or not he wants to move cattle around on a horse and with a dog, or if he wants to create some sort of rotation, and if he wants to build a fence, it's up to him. What we do is we provide some technical assistance, and if he has a question about, well, what happens if I do this? Well, okay, well, here's what I think would happen. It's no different from the livestock specialist at Minister of Agriculture offering up an agricultural producer, a livestock producer, information on, genetics or nutrition or those kind of things. That's the role we play, but the final decision, again, is in the producer's hand. And, you let him go ahead and manage the land the way he wants to. And what we do then is that we go out and we start monitoring. And generally, as a rule of thumb, what we do is, the targets that we're measuring. We will run 2 transects for every section of land. So every 640 acres, we'll try to get 2 transects in. Each transect will have 25 data points on it, and then the data is gathered and collected and summarized. And at the end of the summer, we determine whether or not the habitat targets were achieved. So, and we usually have a small army of students and contractors and that working for us. So I think last summer we had 5 or 6 different people working on this, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and guys have to be out in the field. You're basically working 7 days a week almost, as long as you can get into some of these places. Now, the payments that are made to the producer, we are basing our valuation based on $3.50 per acre per year. If he achieves all his targets, that's what he gets. And that number came to us by doing some literature reviews and looking at some similar type programs. There was a program out of Wyoming that was paying somewhere between $3 and $5 an acre. There's some other literature reviews we did, and so we finally settled on $3.50 an acre. Is that what we wanted to pay for? Originally, we had talked about, what's the actual cost of environmental management? And we're trying to do that as well. We've got an economist helping us, and we've got Dr. Jeremy Pittman helping us on trying to actually determine the actual cost of environmental management. And so that means tweaking out the differences between what the producer does for environment to achieve the targets and what he does as part of his cattle operation. And, it's a little bit of slice and dice, and we've talked about a number of things, and I've listed off a number of things out there that they can do. They can actually reduce the stocking rates, they can provide active rest, they can create additional pastures, they can, move cattle, they can hire contract laborers in to, like to herd cattle, haze cattle, but they can also, learn more. Like, part of this is a learning curve so that they can understand exactly what the species at risk that we're dealing with need, and then they get a better understanding how to achieve it. So it's the same as, again, proper nutrition for cattle. They have to understand, what has more energy, barley or straw? So they have to understand that. They learn that, and that's a part of this as well too. And then the other thing is doing some, anecdotal type monitoring. Like just, the same as they would, look at cattle. They have to start looking at the grass and start looking at it in terms of providing a home for species at risk. And all that takes time, and all takes effort, and takes conscious decisions on providing this. So let's look at this cost. I mean, $3.50 an acre. Well, let's say we have a project on 10,000 acres. Well, that's an annual payment of $35,000. You compare that to some of our other agreements. We have habitat management agreements, which are they're more prescriptive. They're more kind of linked to the farm stewardship BMP with a little bit of added work. Those are usually one-time payments and in return for signing, say, a 10-year agreement to manage the habitat in a certain way. And in those agreements, there's no assurances or no prerequisite that they actually have to achieve the habitat targets. Now, they do some activities, but the cost of those are ranging, and it all depends on the activities that are out there. They are ranging on what somewhere between about $1.50 an acre to about $6 an acre, and what we get is they commit to managing in a certain way for X number of years, and usually it's around 10 years or so. And if you spread like $1.50 over 10 years, you're looking at what, 15 cents a year per acre payment. So it's the BMP habitat management agreements are relatively cheaper, but there's no prerequisite that they actually achieve habitat targets, and there's no need to. So if they manage in a certain way and they don't achieve it, they still get the money. Whereas with the results-based, they have to achieve the target and get that. Now let's flip it on the other way, and there's a lot of pressure or a lot of support from the federal government, Environment Canada, for securement, for conservation easements. Now, generally speaking, the groups that provide or sign conservation easements sign at about 25% fair market value. And if you look at a pasture land trading in that area, there's lots of pasture land trading in that about $80,000 a quarter. That's about $500 an acre. So 25% fair market value of that is about $125 an acre. So you could basically sign a results-based agreement for 35 years for the same value of a conservation easement that's signed in perpetuity. Now, and all you get from the conservation easement is, keep the green side up, right? So it's a no break, no drain. They still don't have to achieve habitat targets, and they don't have to manage in any way. There's no activity associated. It's just, don't break it, don't drain it. And they get a fairly significant chunk of change for that. So if you compare it to some of the other options that are out there, it's actually, I think, a fairly reasonable, economically speaking, way for programming options. So the other thing that goes along with this, and I sort of briefly talked about it, was the technical assistance, and we do a lot of that. We have staffers. I've got some contractors, and we've got some summer staff coming on. These are people that work directly one-on-one with producers. But in addition to that, we try to do some extension and awareness and field days and workshops and stuff like that. And so this provides an opportunity to get people out in the field and talk to like-minded people, and discuss the programming and the options that are out there. And it's an opportunity for producers to talk to producers, and it's an opportunity for us to link into government and politicians. And if you look in the left-hand corner, it's an opportunity for us to make government workers open sensitive. So that's one of the key things that we need to work on too, is the whole extension part of this thing, and increasing awareness, not only of this type of programming, but the whole species at risk issue. So just to wrap it up, where are we right now with results-based conservation agreements? Well, right now, the original Greater Sage-grouse agreements, they ended last year, so we don't have them signed right now. And we had 6 signed. We have, under the SARPAL, we have 10 new agreements signed up under both Sprague's Pipit and Greater Sage-grouse, and we have over 40,000 acres. So what we are making, if it's full payment, is annual payments to producers is just under that $140,000 mark a year. And that in 2016, 17, that's what we paid out. Everybody that we signed up actually met their targets. This last year, there were some producers did not meet their targets, and our total payouts was about $108,000. And the shortfall came on Sprague's Pipit habitat, and it revolved around a couple things. It revolved around the Robel flow measurement, and in one case around range condition. So, and last year was a dry year, you know, verging on drought. So we saw some things out there that, you know, that the height thing probably was affected by drought because the guy's management didn't change. The range condition was a little bit hard to understand because, you know, range condition is basically determined by species composition, and species composition does not change drastically over 1 year. But what we were finding was the expression of some of the plants, and we found probably an expression of Stipa over the western porcupine grass, and one is an increaser species and the other one is a decreaser species, and that actually reduced the range conditions slightly on the one pasture, and it dropped it like from about high 70s to low 70s, and we actually, you know, because he didn't make his cutoff at 75, then he didn't get paid for that portion of it. We still paid him on the 2/3 of the other ones, on the litter loads and on the height measurements, but so he got a 2/3 type payment. But, you know, overall speaking, we paid out probably $30,000 less this year than we did last year. The other thing that I wanted to mention too is that we actually are involved in a grass bank project, and we're using the same philosophy so that basically producers access other lands in exchange for achieving habitat targets on their own lands, and they don't have to pay for the added grass, and that's the concept of grass banking. We're using the same philosophy there. So we tell the producers, okay, if you achieve the greater sage-grouse habitat targets and you achieve the Sprague Pipit habitat targets, you will have access to this added grass in exchange, and that has a value even though, you know, there's no funding paid out to them, but it's the same kind of philosophy. So it's just another form of an ecological service. So, lastly, I just want to touch on a few things here. One, we do have, like I mentioned, we've got about 6 programming options that we're looking at right now, and what we're finding is the acceptance level is extremely high on the results-based, and this is extremely noticeable, I guess, with producers who are, you know, leaders or have a what's a good word, a conservation ethic. So they've already got a conservation ethic. In a large number of these cases, they're already achieving habitat targets. What they're doing now is they're signing the paper saying that they will achieve these habitat targets. But they're the guys that want to do this. They like the concept of having them make the decisions and not dealing with a prescriptive type program. And, you know, under the SARFL funding, we're supposed to actually explore all the programming options. But I got to hold back the Kellys and Kristas and say, okay, listen, we've got to spend some money in some of these other projects so we can evaluate. And we could probably sell out the program on results-based if we wanted to. The other issue is privacy. Guys still are reluctant to discuss species risk publicly a lot, and there's still some animosity. You know, probably stems back to the fear of regulation, the EPO, maybe, you know, scared other people will come out. They just sort of want to still be private, and so we do have privacy clauses written into the contract. The other things that we want to look at is the refinement of targets. You know, range condition, like I said, we didn't pay the one guy today, and all it was the expression of a Stipa comata over a Stipa curticata. And is that right? I can understand if range condition is degraded because of an increase in snowberry woody type species, or broadleaf invasive type species, or you know, things like leafy spurge. But well, you start looking at other species like the Stephacomatas, or even, for example, a fine leaf grass like Kentucky bluegrass, that actually still provides habitat, and we do see the birds where there is Kentucky bluegrass out there. So we have to look at some refinement targets. The other one is the height thing, the visual. You know, what's the attribution to drought, and what's you know, as a result of management. I've already discussed the valuation, and then again, trying to get an understanding what's the influence of drought and climate on the habitat as opposed to management. And the last thing, and I've mentioned this, is that we have to do this in a multi-species at risk context, and we have to be aware of the plan has 13 species listed in it, and there's more species. Chestnut-colored longspur and ferruginous hawk are being added down in that area too, and so there's more and more species that we have to be aware of that you know, we want to make sure that we're not going to do anything detrimental down there. So these are the things that we're learning on, and as I mentioned before, we are being adaptive, and we're trying to include these kind of conversations, and you know, with the species biologists or the species specialists, and have some discussions with them. So that's kind of it. I have to acknowledge the people that give us money and support us. Without them, we don't have any programming whatsoever, and I'm going to leave you with my contact information. And that kind of wraps it up. So I guess I'll turn it back to Kaitlyn, and if she's got some questions. So.
Thank you very much, Tom. That presentation was really, really informative. I'd just like to let our listeners know that if you have any questions, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. And we have a few questions here already. A listener named Krista would like to know if SODCAP is doing work in the Missouri Coteau, or does someone else administer the SARPO funds in that area?
No, SODCAP is actually still delivering in that area. So the people that work for us are visiting the landowners in that area. And so, you know, it's the same contact information. So.
Great, thank you. Can these agreements be applied to provincial lease lands, or are they only on deeded land?
No, we are signing these agreements on Crown lease, and the only caveat is that we have to get a signature of acknowledgement from the Minister of Agriculture, and so we've sat down with them, and they've in the agreements there's a clause there that has a place for them. They recognize this as they're consenting to this. They're not a signature of the lease, but they are providing consent to this, so that they are aware of it, and you know, it's good by them. So they get a look at all these contracts that we've signed.
Great, thank you for that answer. A listener named Stephen would like to know how do contracts work in cases where the land changes hands?
We have in the contract, we actually have a provision there that they have to, if they do sell the land or the lease changes to somebody else, we have a form in there that they fill out, and it goes to the next owner.
Great, thanks. A listener named Jonathan says, "Hi Tom, great presentation, thank you." And he's wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Grass Bank's work and practice. And that his name's Jonathan from Veresco Solutions.
Okay. Well, the whole concept of Grass Bank is that where there's a block of conservation land, for a lack of a better word, and it, you know, the probably the most famous one is the Matador Ranch in Montana, near Malta, Montana, and it's owned by the Nature Conservancy, different from Nature Conservancy of Canada. And what they do is they allow a group of lessees or ranchers that are in that area to use their land at a reduced rate in exchange for tangible conservation benefits on the private land. So when they're at home, they're providing conservation benefits, and they have a list of and a formula of activities, things they consider conservation benefits, and the value of those, and then they use that to determine how much of the lease revenue is reduced for those producers. So it's kind of taking a core area of conservation land and using it to influence a larger land base, and work for the ranchers and work for the conservation without actually having to go out and buy all this other land. So that's the way it works. So in Canada here, another example is the Sandstone Ranch owned by Nature Conservancy of Canada in Alberta, and we are toying with the idea here right now in the Southwes Divide. So, and I'm not gonna say anything more, and because it's still some negotiations, but that's the concept, and it actually, I think it's a really good one, and it could be applied to something as big as like the Matador, which is 60,000 acres, to, you know, NCC owning a section of land and using that to influence another 600 acres. You know, it's sort of up for discussion.
Thank you for that answer. A listener named Stephen would like to know in regards to habitat and endangered species preservation, how do these contracts with landowners compare to the conservation of species through parcels of land put aside, such as Grasslands National Park?
Oh, boy, that's a tough question. You know, one thing that we don't do is actually go out and monitor the species themselves. We are more concerned with the habitat. So I guess I would probably have to defer that question to, you know, people that are actually monitoring, you know, different species and looking at the surveys. So I can't give you an honest answer right now. All I know is that, you know, when you look at like Grasslands National Park, we are working with a number of the producers in direct proximity to the park who are actually also providing habitat, and you know, working with the park in, you know, exchanging ideas, and we do have a relationship with them. So I mean, the other things too is these big ex-PFRA pastures. You take an example like Beaver Valley or Val Marie, you know, probably the biggest or benefit is their size. Those two pastures together are about 160,000 acres, and the surrounding land base is also managed by producers, and so it's a core of probably 300,000 acres of habitat, and so it's extremely important that you work with the producers right around these core activities. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's probably the best I could give you as far as, you know, are we recovering species, and is it having an impact, or is it any different from, say, Grasslands National Park?
Thanks, Tom. A listener named Christine would like to know, how do landowners learn about native plant species and how to manage those native plant species? Is there an education program that they can attend?
Like I mentioned, we do have some extension events. The other thing too is PCAP has usually an annual event, and you probably know better than I do, Kaitlyn, is on Native Prairie Appreciation Week. There's a whole series of events, or has been over the years, and so PCAP and their partners lead a lot of extension events. SODCAP will lead a bunch of extension events. The other major players are you know, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Environment. In fact, the Ministry of Agriculture, under the new CAP program in the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, are hiring 4 agri-environmental specialists to work out of, and one will be out of Swift Current, and I think it's vacant right now. But those are the folks and the technical assistants that if you have questions, you can come to any one of those type of groups. You can come to us or them or PCAP and go online and just track down as much information as you want and see about the events that are out there. So there's more than one group doing this kind of stuff. So.
Great. Thanks, Tom. I think that's all the questions that we have right now. So I would just like to remind our listeners out there that we have events going on throughout the week for Prairie's Got the Goods Week, and you can check out the PCAP website for more information about these webinars, and that's www.pcap-sk.org, and just click on Upcoming Events and Ecological Goods and Services Week. I'd also like to mention that we do have a questionnaire that'll pop up when you're done this webinar. If our listeners out there don't mind filling it out, it will just take a minute, and this will give us some feedback so we can continue this event in the future. I'd also like to thank our sponsors again, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Wildlife Habitat Canada, and Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association. I'd also like to mention too that a recording of this video, as well as our Native Prairie Speaker Series webinars and other webinars going on throughout Prairie's Got the Goods Week, will be uploaded to the PCAP YouTube channel. So you can check out that link and pass this link on to anyone who wasn't able to make it here today. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, Tom, for the really informative presentation. And thank you to all of our listeners out there for tuning in. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Okay.